Somewhere in the National Archives there is a list with your family's name on it, and next to that name, a blank space where a number should be. That blank was not an accident. It was a decision. For thousands of people, that empty box became a weapon, used a century later to erase them from a nation their ancestors helped build, bled for, and were promised they belonged to. This is the story of the Cherokee Freedmen, and the way it finally ended, in a federal courtroom, is something almost no one saw coming. It began with a promise. The promise was written in 1866, and it was written in the language of law, which is supposed to be permanent. But to understand why that promise was necessary, you have to go back further, into a part of American history that almost nobody tells you about at school. Because the story of the Cherokee Freedmen does not begin with freedom, it begins with slavery. And the history of slavery in America runs through places most people are never taught to look, including inside the native nations themselves. The Cherokee Nation held slaves. So did the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, the 5 nations that white America politely called the 5 civilized tribes, a name that itself tells you how the era saw them. By 1860, there were more than 2,000 enslaved black men, women, and children living inside the Cherokee Nation alone. They were bought and sold. They were listed as property in wills and estate records. Some of the wealthiest Cherokee families ran plantations worked by enslaved labor, and the biggest slaveholders in the nation held dozens of people at a time. This is not a comfortable fact, and it is not meant to be. It is simply true, and everything that comes after depends on you understanding it. Enslaved people appear in the nation's own records, the way property always does, counted in censuses, listed in the estates of the dead, transferred in wills from one generation of a slaveholding family to the next. When the 1835 census of the Cherokee was taken before removal, the roll historians call the Henderson Roll, it counted not just Cherokee households and the white people married into them, but the enslaved people held within those households, tallied alongside the livestock and the acreage as part of a family's wealth. That is how the system saw human beings, as a number in a column, a line in an inventory. Keep that image in your mind, the human being reduced to an entry in a ledger, because in this story the ledger is never neutral. The ledger is the battlefield. Now here is where it gets stranger and more human. Because slavery inside the Cherokee Nation was not a carbon copy of slavery in the Deep South. The lines were blurrier. Enslaved people and Cherokee families lived close, worked close, and over generations, their bloodlines mixed. Many enslaved people learned to speak Cherokee fluently. Some grew up inside Cherokee households, and some were, quite literally, the children and grandchildren of the very Cherokee men who owned them. Remember that detail. It is the knife that returns at the end of this story, and when catastrophe struck the Cherokee Nation, the enslaved suffered it too. In the 1830s, when the United States forced the Cherokee off their homelands in Georgia and the Carolinas, when families were driven west at gunpoint through the winter that history remembers as the Trail of Tears, the enslaved people went with them. They were marched along the same frozen roads. They drove the wagons, carried the belongings, and buried the dead. Thousands died on that march, Cherokee and enslaved black alike, and they were buried in the same ground, far from anywhere any of them had chosen to be. Whatever else the Cherokee Nation and its enslaved people were to each other, they had already survived the same apocalypse together, on the same trail, in the same terrible year. That shared history is written into the soil of Oklahoma. Hold on to it, because later, powerful people will try to pretend it never happened. Then came the Civil War, and the war tore the Cherokee Nation in half. Some Cherokee sided with the Union, but the nation's official government allied with the Confederacy, the side fighting to preserve slavery. A Cherokee general named Stand Watie rose to become a Confederate brigadier general, and he holds a grim distinction in American history. He was the last Confederate general in the entire country to formally surrender more than a month after the war was supposedly over. The Cherokee Nation had gambled on the losing side of a war about slavery. And when you lose that kind of war, the winner sets the terms. The terms came in 1866. The United States did not treat the Cherokee Nation as an innocent bystander. It forced a new treaty, a Reconstruction Treaty, the same kind imposed on the southern states. And buried in that treaty was a single clause that would echo for the next 150 years. Article 9. It declared that all the formerly enslaved people of the Cherokee Nation and all free black people who had been living in the nation, and this is the crucial part, all of their descendants, would have all the rights of native Cherokees. All the rights, not some, not a lesser tier, not a temporary courtesy. Full citizenship, forever, passed down through the generations exactly like anyone else's. That was the promise. Say it to yourself one more time, because everything that follows is the long, ugly, and finally triumphant story of people trying to break it and one family who would not let them. The treaty went even further than citizenship. It set aside 160 acres of land for each freedman head of household who wanted to settle and farm. It granted voting rights. It recognized the freedmen as part of the political body of the nation. On paper, in 1866, the Cherokee Freedmen had everything, and for a little while, the promise was real. They built farms. They founded all-black towns across Indian Territory, communities with their own churches, their own schools, their own newspapers, their own self-government. Some freedmen were elected to the Cherokee National Council, the nation's own legislature. Think about that. Formerly enslaved people, sitting as lawmakers in the government of the nation that had once owned them. And those all-black towns were not tiny or fragile experiments. Across Indian Territory, dozens of them took root self-governing communities with black mayors, black sheriffs, black-owned stores, and cotton gins and printing presses, places where a black family could own their land and educate their children and vote for their leaders at a moment when almost nowhere else in the American South allowed any of those things at once. To a black family living under the daily terror of the post-war South, Indian Territory could look like the closest thing to freedom on the map. Word spread. People migrated toward it. For a brief and remarkable window, this corner of what would become Oklahoma was one of the few places in post-Civil War America where black citizenship was not just a theory written in a distant amendment, but a lived, working, everyday reality with land under it and a vote behind it. But a promise is only as strong as the will to keep it, and the will began to crack almost immediately. The first crack appeared over money. In 1883, the Cherokee Nation was due to receive a large payment from the United States funds from the sale of Western lands. And when it came time to divide that money among the citizens, the Cherokee National Council passed an act. That act created a roll, a list of citizens of the Cherokee Nation by blood, and only the people on that by blood roll would share in the money. In one stroke, the freedmen, who had been promised all the rights of native Cherokees just 17 years earlier, were cut out of the payment. The phrase "by blood" had entered the machinery of the Cherokee government. It would never leave, and a century later, it would become the exact weapon used to erase the freedmen entirely. But in 1883, it was just about a payment, just about money. That is how these things always begin: small, technical, easy to look away from. 3 years later, in 1886, the Cherokee legislature went further. It reinterpreted the treaty itself. It declared that the phrase "all the rights of native Cherokees" should be understood to mean only the rights enjoyed by adopted white citizens, the white men who had married into the nation. In plain terms, it tried to downgrade the freedmen from full citizens to something lesser, cutting them out of land ownership and out of the nation's shared revenue. The guarantee of 1,866 was being quietly redefined, word by word, in the fine print of Cherokee law. This is a pattern you will see again and again in this story. Nobody stood up and openly said, "We are erasing these people." They did it with definitions, with roles, with categories, with blank boxes. It is a quieter kind of violence, and in some ways a more effective one, because it does not look like violence at all. It looks like paperwork, and paperwork does not leave scars you can photograph. There is no burning building, no marching army, no single moment a camera could have captured. There is only a clerk, a pen, a category, and a definition repeated across thousands of pages, over decades, until an entire people has been quietly written toward the edge of the record. That is what makes this kind of erasure so hard to fight. You cannot point to a battlefield. You can only point to a blank space in a column and try to explain to people who were not there why that blank space was one of the most consequential things ever done to your family. Most people never learn to read a document that way, to see the violence hiding inside the neat handwriting. By the end of this story, you will not be able to unsee it. The freedmen did not accept it quietly. A man named Moses Whitmire, acting as trustee for the freedmen of the Cherokee Nation, took the fight all the way to the Court of Claims in Washington, D.C. The freedmen argued they were owed their share, as the treaty promised. And out of that legal battle came a series of federal efforts to actually count the freedmen properly. because the Cherokee Nation kept disputing how many of them there really were. In 1890, a special federal agent named John Wallace compiled what became known as the Wallace Roll, the first roll of Cherokee freedmen authorized by the United States government itself, created precisely because the Cherokee Nation was reluctant to pay them what they were owed. Then, when the nation disputed Wallace's numbers, another commission compiled the Kern-Clifton Roll in 1896 and 1897, checking and rechecking, taking testimony, cross-examining witnesses. These rolls have long, dry, bureaucratic names, but understand what they actually represent. They are the paper trail of a people repeatedly forced to prove they existed. Again and again, these families had to stand before commissions and establish, with witnesses and sworn testimony, that they were who they said they were, that they had been where they said they had been, that they belonged where the treaty said they belonged. And you can still read what that cost real human beings. There was a woman named Parmelia, a freedwoman who had left the nation during the upheaval and later returned to find her father. She had a half-brother who was a recognized Cherokee citizen. She had witnesses, people who remembered seeing her at Fort Gibson, people who could place her, people who knew her family. She appeared before the court not once, but 3 times, insisting her name belonged on the rolls, and 3 times she was denied. She was placed instead on what they called the doubtful list, rejected on a technicality about absent witnesses. 1 woman, 1 name, 1 blank, where a citizenship should have been, and multiply that by thousands. That is what these rolls really are. Not dead paper, the frozen record of thousands of individual fights, most of which we will never know the details of, each one a person insisting, "I am here, I count, write me down." And the questions the commissions asked were not gentle. Applicants were made to recite the most intimate details of lives that slavery had deliberately shattered. The date and place of a birth that may never have been recorded. The name of a mother sold away years before. The name of the person who had owned them. The maiden names, the former husbands, the scattered children of a family that had been bought and sold across state lines. People who had been forbidden by law to read or write were now required to prove, with documents and corroborating witnesses, the very facts that slavery had gone out of its way to erase. Imagine being asked to produce paperwork for a past that was designed to leave no paperwork. That was the impossible test laid in front of them. And on the strength of 5 witnesses, or the absence of 3, a family's entire future could be waved through or turned away. Which brings us to the role that would matter more than all the others combined. Because at the turn of the century, the United States arrived with a new plan, the biggest and most destructive of them all. The plan was called allotment. For centuries, tribal nations held their land in common. The whole nation owned the whole territory together. Washington wanted that broken apart. It wanted every native person assigned an individual parcel of land, so that the enormous leftover surplus could be open to white settlement. It was, in effect, a legal machine for transferring native land into white hands, and it worked with devastating efficiency. But to divide the land among individuals, the government first had to produce a definitive list of exactly who those individuals were. And so, in 1896, Congress established a commission to create the final membership rolls of the 5 tribes. It was led by a senator named Henry Dawes, and the rolls it produced between 1898 and 1907 are called the Dawes Rolls. I need you to understand how much these rolls still matter, because this is not distant history. To this day, the Dawes Rolls are the foundation document of Cherokee citizenship. If you want to enroll as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation right now, in the 21st century, you generally have to trace your ancestry to a person listed on the Dawes Rolls. Your entire legal identity as a Cherokee can hang on a name written in a ledger over 100 years ago. That is how much power lives in this one list. Citizenship in a modern tribal nation is not a sentimental thing. It can mean the right to vote in tribal elections, to run for tribal office, to receive health care through tribal clinics, to access housing assistance, education funding, and a share in the resources and future of the nation. To be recognized is to have a seat at the table of a living government. To be excluded is to stand outside the door of your own family's house, listening to a decision being made about you, without you. That is what was truly at stake in how a person was recorded. And that is exactly why what the Dawes Commission did to the freedmen was not a paperwork error. It was catastrophic, and its effects are still being felt by real families today. Here is how the trap was built. When a person came before the Dawes Commission, The enrollers did not simply write down their name and move on. They sorted them. They placed each person into a category: Cherokee by blood, intermarried white, and a third, entirely separate list: Cherokee Freedmen. If the commission placed you on the by blood roll, they recorded your degree of Cherokee blood a fraction, a specific number, 1/2, 1/4, 1/8. But if the enroller looked at the color of your skin and decided you belonged on the Freedmen roll, they wrote down no blood quantum at all. None. A blank. Even when that person had a Cherokee parent. Even when everyone in the community knew the family's Cherokee lineage going back generations. Even when the applicant stood there and named their Cherokee father and pointed to Cherokee relatives already recorded on the by blood roll, the commission would write Freedmen, leave the blood column empty, and call the next name. Sit with what that means, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. Two siblings, same mother, same father, same blood, could be split onto two different rolls. One child, lighter skinned, recorded as Cherokee by blood, with a number beside their name. The other child, darker skinned, stamped Freedman, with a blank. Same family, same ancestry, same parents. Two completely different fates, decided by a stranger's glance and a stranger's pen. And it was not confusion or carelessness. It was policy. Skin color decided the category. The category decided whether a number was written. And that number or the absence of it would decide, 100 years later, whether that person's descendants had a nation at all. The people being sorted often understood, even in the moment, that something was being done to them that would outlast them. Some protested. Some named their Cherokee kin and demanded to be recorded correctly. It changed nothing. The enrollers had their categories, and the categories held. That blank box was not a clerical footnote. It was a time bomb, set in 1902, with a fuse a century long. And then the fuse began to burn slowly at first. Allotment stripped away the tribal land base, parcel by parcel. Much of the land they had been promised was lost, sold off, or swindled away in the chaos that followed, just as it was lost by native allottees across the territory. The Curtis Act dismantled the tribal courts and governments. In 1907, Indian Territory became the state of Oklahoma, and the pressure on black families across the region grew heavier with every passing decade as Jim Crow tightened its grip on the new state. The all-black towns that freedmen had built began to shrink and struggle. But through all of it, the freedmen held on. They kept their communities. They kept their churches and their families. And technically, on paper, they kept their citizenship even as the Cherokee Nation's own government was slowly strangled into near non-existence by federal control. For much of the 20th century, the Cherokee Nation barely functioned as a government at all. Its chiefs were, for a time, appointed by the President of the United States rather than elected. The nation was a shadow of itself. But nations can come back to life. And when the Cherokee Nation came roaring back in the 1970s, rebuilding its constitution, reasserting its sovereignty, electing its own leaders again, the old question came roaring back with it. Who counts as Cherokee? And this time, the blank boxes from 1902 were waiting. The tightening became visible in 1983. To vote in a Cherokee Nation election, you were now required to present a specific federal document, a certificate of degree of Indian blood, a CDIB card. And that card required a blood quantum, which required tracing to a by blood ancestor on the Dawes rolls, which the freedmen, by deliberate design, did not have. In one administrative move, thousands of descendants, people whose great-grandparents had voted in Cherokee elections and sat in the Cherokee legislature and been promised full citizenship in a federal treaty, were quietly pushed away from the ballot box. Most Americans never heard a whisper about it. It did not make the national news. It was, once again, just paperwork, just a card requirement, just a technicality. That is how the quiet violence works. But the loudest blow was still coming, and it landed on a single day in the 21st century. March 2007. The Cherokee Nation held a special election. On the ballot was a constitutional amendment that would limit citizenship to descendants of people listed by blood on the Dawes rolls. Stripped of its legal language, the amendment did one thing. It expelled the freedmen, and it passed. According to the nation's own figures, 2,867 Cherokee freedmen citizens were disenrolled, living, breathing, legally enrolled Cherokee citizens, erased in a single vote. People who had voted in the previous election were suddenly informed that they were not Cherokee, and, the argument went, never truly had been. Their citizenship cards became worthless overnight. 141 years after a treaty had promised them everything, a ballot took it all back. And it is worth noting that only a small fraction of the nation's own membership actually turned out to cast that vote. A great deal of history can be decided by a small room of people on a single afternoon. Now, this is the point where a lazier telling would just pick a villain and start shouting. But the truth here is harder and far more interesting than a cartoon. Because this was also, genuinely, a fight about sovereignty, about the right of any nation to decide for itself who its members are. That is one of the most fundamental powers any nation possesses, and the Cherokee Nation argued, with real legal weight behind it, that it was simply exercising that right. The freedmen's answer was equally serious, that a treaty signed with the United States stands above any later internal vote, and that this particular amendment was not really an exercise of sovereignty at all. It was racial exclusion, wearing the costume of self-government. Both of those arguments deserve to be taken seriously. And the collision between them, tribal sovereignty on one side, treaty-guaranteed rights on the other, is exactly why this case became one of the most important and most watched in the modern history of Indian law. The person who forced the courts to finally choose between those two arguments was not a politician or a famous activist. She was an engineer from Oklahoma named Marilyn Vann, a freedman descendant who simply refused to disappear. She helped lead an organization of descendants from across all 5 of the tribes. She organized, she testified, she sued, and she kept suing, year after year, as the case ground its way through the federal system with agonizing slowness. Thousands of people's identities frozen in legal limbo the entire time. It took a decade, 10 years of litigation, motions, appeals, and delay. And then, on the 30th of August, 2017, a senior United States district judge named Thomas Hogan issued his ruling in the case titled Cherokee Nation versus Nash. It ran 78 pages, and it went straight back to the beginning, straight back to 1866, straight back to Article 9. Judge Hogan found that the promise made in that treaty was still binding, still alive, still enforceable after 151 years. He wrote that the Cherokee Freedmen have a present right to citizenship in the Cherokee Nation that is coextensive with the rights of native Cherokees, meaning their citizenship rises and falls in tandem with everyone else's, neither superior nor inferior. He acknowledged that the Cherokee Nation retains the sovereign right to define itself as it sees fit, but ruled that it must do so equally and even-handedly, and that it could not use a later constitutional amendment to extinguish a right that was anchored not in the Cherokee Constitution, but in a federal treaty. The 2007 vote, he ruled, was unlawful. The blank box did not win. The promise did. And here is the turn that keeps this from ending in bitterness, the part almost no one expects. The Cherokee Nation did not spend the next 10 years fighting to overturn the ruling. It accepted the decision. It began processing their citizenship applications. And in 2021, the Cherokee Nation's own Supreme Court went further still, ordering the words, "by blood," struck entirely from the nation's laws and its constitution. The nation's own principal chief publicly affirmed that the freedmen are citizens, full citizens, equal citizens, no qualifier, no asterisk. The government that had once tried to erase them became, by the ruling of its own highest court, the government that wrote them back in. Today, their descendants are once again citizens of the Cherokee Nation, with the right to vote, to run for office, to receive services, to belong. The name that was stamped Freedmen and left blank in 1902 now stands, in the eyes of the law, exactly equal to every other name on the roll. But do not close the book yet, because the fight is not finished. It has only moved. The Cherokee were one of 5 nations, and all 5 held slaves, and all 5 signed treaties in 1866 with their own promises to their own freedmen. And in most of those other nations, the descendants of those freedmen are still shut out to this day, still fighting the same fight over the same kind of rolls, with the same blank boxes used against them. The Seminole freedmen, whose ancestors once fought side by side with the Seminole in the swamps of Florida in a decades-long war against the United States Army, have been pushed to the margins of the very nation they helped defend. The Creek freedmen have carried their own case through tribal and federal courtrooms, winning in one room and losing in the next, the outcome still unsettled. The Choctaw and Chickasaw freedmen wait as well. Each nation is its own sovereign. Each treaty is its own document. Each fight is its own long, grinding battle. But the shape of the story is nearly identical every single time. A promise in 1866. A by blood roll in the decades after. A blank box around 1900. An erasure generations later. And a handful of families who refused to accept it. And the cost of that erasure was never abstract. It was measured in real lives in grandparents who died still carrying citizenship cards that had been declared worthless. In children who grew up hearing that they were Cherokee and then were told by a government form that they were not. In family reunions where one branch could enroll and another branch, from the same bloodline, could not. Erasure does not happen to a people all at once. It happens one funeral, one denied application, one confused child at a time. Which is exactly why the people who fought back were not fighting over a technicality. They were fighting for the right to hand their own history down to their own grandchildren intact, the most basic thing any family wants, and the very thing the blank box was designed to take. So think, finally, about what a name on a list actually is. We treat these old rolls as dead paper, faded ink, brittle pages, something for genealogists to squint at through a microfilm reader. They are not dead paper. They are live wires, still carrying current a century after they were written. A single word placed beside your ancestor's name in 19021 category, one blank, where a number should have gone reached across 100 years and decided whether that person's descendants would have a country. That is the terrible, almost unbelievable power hidden inside a government record. It can grant an entire people everything. It can be twisted, decades later, into the exact instrument that takes it all away. And, as the Cherokee Freedmen finally proved, it can be turned back again. The Cherokee Freedmen were told, over and over, in every language power speaks by pens and payment rolls, by categories and blank boxes, by voting cards and ballot measures and courtroom motions, that they did not belong. Their ancestors were enslaved by the nation, freed by a war, promised full citizenship by a treaty, cut out of a payment, downgraded by a legislature, forced to prove their own existence before commission after commission, sorted by the color of their skin, quietly pushed from the ballot box, and finally expelled outright by a single vote. And then, after 150 years of all of it, they were told by a federal judge and by the Cherokee Nation's own highest court that the promise had been real the entire time. That is not a story about paperwork. That is a story about people who refused to be erased, no matter how many times and in how many ways someone reached for the eraser. If your family carries this history, listen closely. Maybe there is a Freedman roll number somewhere in your past. Maybe a story about ancestors in Indian Territory. Maybe a Cherokee connection your family always spoke of but could never quite prove on paper. If so, then this is your history, and it is far larger and far braver than you were ever told. Tell me in the comments where your family traces back to. Tell me the name, the nation, the town, the roll, the story you grew up hearing at the kitchen table, or the one nobody in your family would ever fully explain. And if you want me to keep decoding the histories that someone, somewhere, once tried to bury the rolls, the treaties, the forgotten towns, the families who outlasted every attempt to wipe them off the record, then subscribe. Because there is another erased story out there right now, sitting in a box in an archive, still waiting for someone to open it and read the name out loud.